Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sydney Richter, and I am a junior political science major here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. I also serve as a student coordinator with the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, which is one of our sponsors of tonight's event. We also appreciate our other co-sponsors, the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning and the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research. We are so excited for today's interfaith conversation on labor, religion, politics, and public engagement. Today we are joined by St. John's alum and sociology and peace studies graduate of 1999, Eric LeCompte. LeCompte has served as the director of Jubilee USA Network since 2010, following his work with Catholic Worker and Fellowship of Reconciliation. He regularly appears on media outlets, including the Associated Press News, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, for his views on religion, politics, and economic issues. Jubilee USA is an interfaith coalition of 75 development and advocacy organizations and more than 750 religious groups from throughout the United States and around the world to win policies that alleviate poverty, address global conflict, and promote human rights. The Afl Cio, which is the largest federation of labor unions in the United States, is one of the longest-standing member organizations of Jubilee USA's Network Council. We are joined today by Damon Silvers, Senior Strategic Advisor and Special Counsel to the President of Afl Cio. Silvers joined the Afl Cio as Associate General Counsel in 1997 and later served as the Director of Policy and Special Counsel before being named to his current position. Additionally, Eugene J. McCarthy Center Director and Political Science Professor, Dr. Matt Lindstrom, will be joining us to moderate the Q&A portion of tonight's event. And when we do get to the Q&A portion, we're going to be sending around this form to be added onto the Jubilee USA Network's email list so you can get updates about what's going on. And we'd love for you all to join that if you can. Please give a warm welcome to Eric LeCompte and Damon Silvers.
Each other. Thank you, Aaron. We have the best tech team at St. Ben's and St. John's, so give them a hand. And really, thanks to Sydney for that wonderful introduction. Really, we also want to lift our gratitude to the McCarthy Center, to the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Studies, as well as the Collegeville Institute. We've been really lucky to be hosted by Matt Lindstrom and his team at the McCarthy Center, John Merkel and his team at J. Phillips Interfaith Studies, as well as Jacqueline Bussey from the Ecumenical Institute, the Collegeville Institute, for today's event. We just want to point out, as we go through this hour together, that we're joined online right now from around the world. We have people viewing in from Ghana, Zimbabwe, El Salvador, Rome, as well as Puerto Rico, California, and many states across the United States. In particular, we're excited by the quite significant number of union members who we got in the registration list who are also online today. So they're going to be joining the conversation online. Damon and I are going to speak, have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. So as we begin, this conversation, Damon, it's so exciting to have you here at St. John's and St. Ben's. Even though you're here a brief time, it's been really great to have you connecting with so many in the community at a place where there's been a long history of a connection between labor and religion, really going back to the early years of the monastic communities. When people see Damon and I in Washington, D.C., because we do a lot of work together, working on issues that range from Puerto Rico disaster relief to workers' rights, inequality campaigns, poverty. When people see Damon and I walking down the street or coming to the White House, wherever we're at, people say, oh, look, there's the labor and religion guy again. So we thought we would come on tour as the labor and religion guy, kind of our mantras in DC. But the reason that the labor and the religion guy hang out a lot is because not only are our values aligned, but we have a very particular vision of the world that we're trying to move forward. So I guess in terms of starting the conversation today, we want to congratulate, the Afl Cio is the largest union in the world, and they just have a new president, Liz Schuler, who started a tremendous partner in religion. And I say that also knowing we just lost a truly, truly great leader of the Afl Cio, President Rich Trumka. Very close to the Catholic Church and religion, someone who's been a real friend in terms of understanding the needs for religion and labor to work very closely together. So I'm curious, we'd like to hear a little bit, if you might want to speak about Rich, who recently passed away, and what his connection was to the Catholic Church. Why did he think that connection of religion? And we know previous AFL-CIO presidents like John Sweeney felt the same. But I'm wondering, since we're thinking of Rich now, if you might want to talk a little bit about him, and then perhaps speak about your own personal sense, from your personal standpoint of what's the value and the connection between religion and labor from your point of view.
All right, great, Eric. Well, thank you, and good afternoon. It's really just a great pleasure and honor to be here with all of you and all of you who are watching on some kind of digital format. This has been a real being here at St. John's and St. Ben's has been a huge learning experience for me as an East Coast type person. This is a place where very, very important work was done to help working people, and continues to be done. But in particular during the Depression, this institution gave voice to the aspirations of working people, both in the communities around here, people who worked on the land, and working people in the larger country, and helped form and inform the Catholic worker movement, which in a variety of ways was very important to me personally. My parents were, well, neither of them were Catholic. My parents were great admirers of Dorothy Day, and I had the great and fleeting privilege of learning directly from Michael Harrington, who was a protege of Dorothy Day's and carried on the Catholic worker movement after her death. These people were very meaningful in my life, and so I'm really very happy to be here. Now, as Eric said, my dear friend and brother Richard Trumka died suddenly of a heart attack in August. He was the president of the Afl Cio, and he was a very profound admirer of the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and devoted to dialogue with the Church on the critical issues facing both working people in the United States and the global economy. But before that, he was a coal miner, and he was the son of coal miners and the grandson of coal miners. He grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania. And I'm going to tell you a story about that he used to tell, and he's unfortunately no longer with us to tell it, but we can tell it. By the way, there's a reference to Jewish thought in that remark. Eric wants me to make sure to make some references to Jewish thought, so there's one. So Rich used to tell this story when asked what his Catholic faith meant to him. And he would say this, that in the town he grew up in Nemacolin, Pennsylvania, when his father was a young man in the 1930s, at the time that Virgil Michael and other people were thinking about these issues here in this place, that at that time, the coal company owned everything in the town, absolutely everything, except for the church. They owned people's houses, they owned the store, they owned the railroad station, they owned everything except the church. And not only that, but they had a special police force, the Pennsylvania Coal and Iron Police. That was a state police force that was empowered to, quote, police coal and steel communities, which meant that their job was to break unions. And the coal company's view was that no union organizing was allowed on their property, which meant no union organizing was allowed anywhere in the community. And so Rich's father and his uncles and his grandfather, and they and their friends, they were Slovakian and Italian immigrants. They organized the union in the woods. So they would meet in the woods and plan essentially a strike. And the coal and iron police would search for them in the woods on horseback with truncheons. And they would chase them through the woods. And one particular night, they caught Rich's father and his uncles out in the woods and ran them down with horses and clubs. And they clubbed Rich's dad to the ground. And his brothers picked him up and carried him to the steps of the church. Now, I've been to this church. It's on a little hill, right? And so it's a set of granite steps that lead up to it. And it's a little tiny church. It's smaller than this room. And the miners crawled up the steps of that church, and the horsemen followed them up the steps, club in hand. And the priest came out of the church with a crucifix and said to the horsemen, "You cannot come here. You cannot come here." And the horsemen turned back, and they pulled Rich's dad into the church and bandaged his wounds and got him home safely. Now, in Rich Trumka's mind, that was the church. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about my own experience that speaks to the question of the relationship between labor and religion in our time. In 2017, people may remember that a series of devastating hurricanes struck Puerto Rico. And that despite being part of the United States, that the United States government chose not to help Puerto Rico. And that weeks after the hurricane struck, in most of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, other than the wealthiest neighborhoods, there was no power and no water. Some of us at the Afl Cio went to President Trumka, went to Rich, the man I was just talking about, and said, we need to do something. We can help. We can bring skilled workers to Puerto Rico. And we, with Rich's blessing and support, and more than that, I mean, he squeezed people out. He got on the phone with the union presidents and as they say, insisted. We filled the plane, the biggest plane that United Airlines has. And United Airlines was very generous. They donated the plane. They said, you can fly the whole plane for free to Puerto Rico. United Airlines is a union shop, wall to wall. And we filled that plane with workers, with skilled workers, with heavy equipment operators and nurses and doctors and electricians and people, carpenters, skilled workers of all kinds that were specifically requested by the city of San Juan. And we flew them down to Puerto Rico. And so we say things were not entirely tight on the ground. I mean, in fact, they were desperate. The city brought us to the only place in San Juan at that time that there was secure power and water, which was the baseball stadium. And the baseball stadium and the municipal coliseum kind of place. The mayor of San Juan was living in the coliseum, and they had a warehouse. They had filled the coliseum with bottled water, and they had trucks bringing in like frozen food and so forth. This was the only place in the city where these kinds of supplies were available. It was ringed with soldiers. And we got our folks there, and we managed to get them, into cots. 300 workers from around the mainland United States, and it was very, very kind of, things were not in good shape. And we didn't even have food and water for our own people. Right? And at that moment, the Archbishop of San Juan, Roberto Gonzalez, a friend of Eric's, arrived. And I said to him, Archbishop, can you help me? We don't have any water for our people. And he said, well, of course, we'll go see the mayor. And we went to see the mayor, and the mayor said, because we couldn't get the water out of the system. And the mayor and the Archbishop and I went to a warehouse where they had pallets and unloaded pallets of water. And the Archbishop and I carried the pallets of water to the corridors where our people were sleeping in cots. And we walked through these corridors. It was hot. It was like 90 degrees in the place. And our people had just flown from New York, and they were a little freaked out, frankly, as they should have been. We were doing something quite dangerous, actually.
It was like a war zone.
Right.
At the time.
It was quite dangerous. And we walked the corridor handing out water, and our union members asked Roberto to bless them as we handed out the water bottles. And those men and women went on from there, and Roberto did so. I'm eternally grateful to him. Roberto did so, and those people went out and saved lives. They saved hundreds of lives. They rebuilt schools. They turned on, I was with them when they turned on the air conditioning for a senior citizens' home and tended wounds of people who had been left untreated for weeks, and brought schools back on. And the miracles that skilled construction workers can do in a zone like that is incredible. And I watched them do it. But the support, the solidarity, and the the inspiration that they derive from the presence of the Archbishop there, and all the Archbishop represents for people of faith in that group was, it was irreplaceable. And the solidarity of the church and the labor movement in San Juan on that day is a highlight of my life.
Thank you, Damon. I remember Rich Trumka bringing me in to be with the heads of all the major unions as we were trying to figure out how to solve Puerto Rico's debt crisis, and then the series of disasters that have continued to plague Puerto Rico in the years that followed. And Rich, was responsible for bringing the American labor movement on board in solidarity, not only with the disaster, but solving the economic crisis. As this week with the religious leaders in Puerto Rico, we've been trying to finalize a negotiation on debt relief and disaster relief on an island where 60% of the kids, American citizens, live in poverty. So really, that story is so incredibly powerful. And that really talks about this idea of kind of hands. So I am going to push you on the Jewish perspective
I told you.
a little bit more as we continue the conversation. Damon, you and I over the years have talked a lot about what is it that God calls us to? What does God want for us in this world? How does God envision our world? How does God see us in terms of how we are to live with one another? There are some very particular and different Jewish schools of thought. One of those things, and it was actually a concept that I first heard from a rabbi in this very room about 25 years ago. But this particular idea of what is it that God calls us to. And, for some Jews, there's this idea that God is gone. God is left. God is no longer here. And what God has left for us is the law. God has left for us a vision of how we should be in community with one another and what that responsibility calls us to, this idea of being God's hands. And so I'm hoping that you might, both, I guess, explore that a little bit more with us, as well as share other thinking about what it is what is our responsibility in this world, what is our responsibility to each other and to God.
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a wiser man than I am. But I'm happy to talk about the themes you raise, Eric. So, in this place, my mind is focused a bit more on as we were saying earlier, on Catholic social teaching, but issues of social and economic and workplace justice are, in my mind, foundational in Judaism. If you ask me, what does that mean? I'll tell you. I don't think there is a better kind of handbook, right, to what it is to be a union organizer and what it is to be a bargainer on behalf of workers than the middle chapters of Exodus. All right. People may be aware there is a lively debate about the historicity of Exodus. I read it and I say somebody was there, right? Somebody was in a room where a man pled on the case of slaves to a king, because it is so vividly the experience that my brothers and sisters in the labor movement live every day. And that is about as foundational as one gets in Judaism. I mean, I suppose we could go back to Genesis and the patriarchs, but the story, the Exodus story, and the interaction between Moses and Pharaoh is a profound document of worker organization and worker solidarity, and of what a labor movement is. Now, you said what are we called to do?
Or to be.
Or to be. And again, a second text that responds to this question is another foundational text in Judaism, which is on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It's a fast day, and it's a day in which observant Jews will spend very observant Jews will spend an entire 24 hours in synagogue. But the kind of high point of the day liturgically is the morning service. Now, in contemporary American Judaism, the evening, the Kol Nidra, has risen in importance. But if you sort of look at it theologically, it's the morning service that's most important. And two texts are read in the morning service. One text is a text describing is in Leviticus. It's a text describing the temple service, the service of sacrifice that was performed on Yom Kippur when the temple existed. But the other section, and it's very ritualistic, the Leviticus section, but the other reading in the morning of Yom Kippur, the Haftarah reading, the reading from the prophets, is a reading from Isaiah. And the reading from Isaiah asks and answers Eric's question. Right? So this is the holiest moment in the Jewish religious calendar. And at this moment, the question that Eric poses, which is, what does God ask of us in relation to work, is posed and answered. Isaiah contemplating the observance of Yom Kippur in his day in Jerusalem, says, what kind of fast is this that you hang your head and cover yourself with ash while you oppress your workers? And he says, what does God ask of us? It is not this fakery. right? It is a fast that sets the captive free. That is the foundational text of Judaism in relation to these issues as seen through the prophetic voice. Now, as Eric said, some people, one of the responses, Jewish religious practice has had to come face to face with the problem of evil in very extremely painful ways for thousands of years. And the notion of the withdrawal of God is not a modern notion in Jewish thought. There is a Kabbalistic tradition that we have to, that God has, that the divine, that we have to bring divine sparks back into the world, from a world that where the divine has withdrawn. And Eric expressed another version of this same idea. It's all part of an effort to wrestle with the problem of evil in the world. I think that's a problem that, many of us have had to face very tangibly in recent days, even in our relatively privileged positions here in this country. And I think that the idea that we ourselves, the idea that the answer rests in us, and in our capacity to act, is a central idea in Judaism. It's a central theme, and it informs, I believe, the labor movement in profound ways. And I would just lift up something important for the audience to think about in this regard, which is that somebody said to me while I was here, a very wise man said to me, what a wonderful place this campus was in the 1980s when there was an intense period of engagement with Catholic social teaching. And then he said, those people are gone. Right? But that possibility is not gone. Right? The world is as possible today as it was when Moses negotiated with Pharaoh. Right? The possibility for profound transformative action, it's as real today as it was when the Minneapolis General Strike happened in 1934. That possibility is as real today as then. So, and that is an idea that exists in Judaism. There are other ideas. They're in conflict, but that idea is there, and we need to lift it up.
Thank you.
In that vein, Eric, I wanted to, I get to ask questions too, I wanted to, Eric and I have worked together in Washington on a variety of things, most of which have this common theme of economic justice. And we, I think, share a common commitment to sort of building bridges, maybe some implausible ones. And I wondered, Eric, if you might talk a bit about what conclusions you have drawn from your experience trying to bring people together around common ideas of economic justice, maybe people who maybe might not think they had a lot in common, across partisan lines, across lines of identity, nationality. In this, and I'm hoping that you can build on my point about possibility.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Damon. I think a big part of how we see kind of our view in the world at Jubilee USA as an interfaith religious coalition is that from the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures, there's a very powerful theme that God has given us a rich and abundant, resource-rich world. And we're closest to God, we're closest to the Creator, we're closest to one another when we share that abundance among us. And these themes from our point of view at Jubilee and the 750 religious institutions that make up our organization is that This is a very important message, and it's the foundational message from many of our religious teachings. And to the point in the Bible where we see in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible, laying out this idea of sharing God's abundance. So God created the world in 7 days and created that world for us. And that idea of 7 days was so important to the early believers that Leviticus, Deuteronomy come along to actually legislate this practice of sharing. That every 7 years debts are forgiven, every 7 years slaves are set free, every 7 years people return to their ancestral homes. They let the ground go fallow so that God can help us protect our environment and God can directly give to us, provide for us in that moment. And it became so important that they created a great jubilee, a continual process. Every 7 times 7 years, the 49th or the 50th year, this idea that there is a total restoration, that we are protected, all of us, each and every one, from becoming too rich or too poor. That God has gifted us a world of plenty, abundance, and enough. It's believed, some scriptural scholars argue that as many as 100,000 people in early Hebrew communities lived under these types of laws for periods of time. And then as people got away from the law, they stopped listening to what God had called us to, that idea of relationship. Then the prophets come along, Isaiah, Micah, Amos, reminding people of the Jubilee scripture, of the Jubilee law, to live back in this process where we ensure that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has enough. And after that period of time, we have the Christian scriptures, and this guy Jesus comes along. And in his first public act at the synagogue in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus goes to the front of the room. He unrolls the scripture, the scroll, as it was his custom, when one would return home to their native synagogue, to their native land. And he begins his public ministry by reading the Jubilee scripture from Isaiah, reminding the people of what God has called us to. This is how Jesus' ministry begins. This idea, this very powerful idea of Jubilee, that every 7 years slaves are set free, all debts are relieved. We go back to being in the presence of God where we all have enough. And then every 7 times 7 years is the Great Jubilee. So in Isaiah, in the synagogue, when Jesus is reading, he talks about the year of the Lord's favor, which is that 7 times 7, the great restoration of equality. And we know from reading the scripture that, people are kind of baffled, as he's saying this. People are going, hey, this is the day laborer's son from Nazareth, and he is telling us right now, he is saying to us that inequality is over and that today we are going to restore a vision where we all have enough. So that foundational theme, for us at Jubilee has been very important, and I think what you're raising about this idea of hope and engagement is also very important to that. So Congressional Quarterly cites our work in Washington, D.C. as the last standing bipartisan coalition in Washington. And that's quite an accolade on the one hand, but it's a very sad statement on the other hand. But that's because we're able to harness the power and vision of religious institutions from our founding members and our partners from the Union for Reform Judaism, the Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, Islamic Relief, American Jewish World Service, that these particular institutions believe that engagement is critical in terms of bringing together both sides of the aisle to work on the structural causes of poverty and inequality. And we continue to have success no matter who is sitting in the White House. We continue to have an open door no matter who is in the White House to work on the global structural issues as well as the domestic issues in the U.S. that perpetuate poverty, that trap people in a world where there is too much inequality. These policies of debt, tax, and trade. So right now, we are working at Jubilee on global pandemic response. So in really over the next 5 years, the most consequential economic and climate policies of our lifetime are likely going to be decided. And they're not going to be decided by the United Nations. They're not going to be decided by the COP process and COP26 as we are starting that process right now. All of these things in terms of global poverty, inequality, and protecting our planet, these decisions are going to be made by the G20, the wealthiest countries in the world. These decisions are going to be made by the International Monetary Fund. Who's heard of the International Monetary Fund before? Raise your hand. So some of us have. You know, we see the International Monetary Fund as a very important institution, but most people don't know what the International Monetary Fund is. In fact, right before the pandemic, I stopped 5 people on Capitol Hill. Jubilee's offices are right across from the Capitol in the Methodist building with many of our partners and members there. And I stopped 5 people, 4 of whom worked for members of Congress. And I asked them, what is the International Monetary Fund? 4 out of those 5 people could not give me an answer. They could not tell me what the International Monetary Fund does. But people who work for Congress, people who are the advisors and working for our decision makers. But if I ask any 12-year-old in El Salvador, in Zimbabwe, or the Caribbean island of Grenada, what is the International Monetary Fund? Every 12-year-old might not get it exactly right, but they have a pretty good answer. We believe that the International Monetary Fund is the second most powerful institution on planet Earth, the first being the White House in terms of global economics and policy, the second being the IMF. And unfortunately, many of us don't have an economic literacy to understand the power of this institution, an institution that impacts our lives, our livelihoods, our jobs, almost as much as the very oxygen we breathe. And yet we don't know that over the next 5 years, the International Monetary Fund and the G20 will make some of the most consequential decisions of the next 50 years. How to solve this crisis, how to address inequality, how to prevent the next crisis. So that idea of religion has been very important, and that's why we believe that we're called the last standing bipartisan coalition in Washington, D.C., because a few months ago when we sat down with Janet Yellen and the head of the Union for Reform Judaism, the head of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the head of the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, it was religious leaders that ultimately moved Janet Yellen in March on some very specific aid and development issues in terms of creating a new currency for developing countries to be able to access vaccines, to be able to create social supports for their people, to be able to address this unbelievable tragedy as the developing world now experiences a 3rd and 4th wave of the pandemic. People are dying in the streets. It is an absolutely, absolutely horrific process that's happening not in a few countries, in the majority of the world's countries. So outside of United States, Canada, and Europe, in most places right now, people are dying in the streets because of the pandemic. There was no stimulus package in the developing world for developing countries in terms of being able to deal with the crisis. So with the highest ranking religious leaders in the United States, we sat down with Janet Yellen and we laid out a plan for pandemic response. And within days, she adopted it and moved it forward because of the power. And also, for the first time, we have an acknowledgement on this idea of where the decisions of climate change are going to be made, not at the UN, not at the COP, but by finance ministers. So the Biden administration then was able to move forward a process to start to deal with climate change in terms of where the decisions are going to be made. So it's something that gives us a lot of hope. It's something that I think is important for engagement. But I think something else that gives me hope, Damon, if anyone has been watching the news over the past week, I try to avoid the news when I'm here because it sometimes affects my attitude. But over the last week, we have seen more workers on strike than we have for a very long time. The head of the Afl Cio, who Damon advises, has been on CNN and MSNBC, covered by Fox News and every major media conglomerate about this amazing moment where 140,000 workers in the U.S. Are either on strike or they're about to go on strike. So Damon, I want to ask you maybe to share a little bit about this moment, why it's different than other moments, and also to ask you, Damon, in this particular moment, where is religion? And in this particular moment, what should religion be doing as we're seeing perhaps in a very long time the most significant cross-sectional, diverse labor strike taking place in modern history?
Okay, well, from the IMF to Kellogg's. So Eric mentioned that the Afl Cio has a new president, Liz Schuler. She is the first woman president of the Afl Cio, and she was somebody who organized her own workplace when she was young, and it's an instructive sort of story. Her father was a utility worker in Oregon, and she went to work for the utility company in the administrative offices, and they had a union for the line workers, but they didn't have a union in the administrative offices, and they basically said, well, that's for the men, this was in the 1980s, and that was kind of management's attitude. And Liz and her co-workers demonstrated that that was not true, and that launched her career in the labor movement. And Liz was at the National Press Club this week, talking about working people like herself going out on strike, and why. And I highly recommend the video of the National Press Club is available online. I think it's on YouTube. I really strongly recommend it to you. Liz is, in that video, Liz expresses something about what it means to be an elected leader of working people that is really worth watching. And in a way that I think is new and different and long awaited. And I will try to kind of paraphrase or pick up on this, but I urge you to listen to the original. Two fundamental stories.
And Damon, let me say, we've been getting for 5 minutes the hook sign.
Oh, the hook sign. So this is going to be short stories.
But
short stories.
So
the first is, we have been for 40 years in a period when the idea of human beings as essentially atomized transactional creatures has been dominant. And the revival of 19th century economics, along with 19th century social theory, which in geeky language is called neoliberalism, but that's nothing to do with like New Deal liberalism. It's sort of the opposite, actually. That's been our time. That's been what's happened in our time. And public policy, coming from places globally like the IMF and down to the state and local level, has worked to weaken worker bargaining power, disempower working people, try to cut working people out of public discourse. And what this has culminated, in my view, in the fact that during the pandemic, so many working people were forced to work in unsafe conditions and then told they were essential. Told they were essential and then not rewarded, not paid fairly for what they were doing, and forced to risk their lives to do what they were doing. This is why John Deere workers went on strike. John Deere workers voted down a negotiated contract because they said, we died next to each other in COVID. And this is a decent try here, but it's not good enough. It's not good enough. I heard the leaders of the UAW, the United Auto Workers, say, that's their right. That's our members' right. That's our members' right to define for themselves what they are worth. And that is why they're on strike at John Deere. We now are in a moment when working people feel that they have some power, because what they do is really, really needed. And whether it's agricultural implement workers or nurses at Kaiser Permanente or the workers at the Kellogg Cereal Company, all of whom are on strike today, or the people who design and build and operate the sets in TV and movies, who are looking at a negotiated contract right now and deciding whether it is what they want, which is how it's supposed to work. All these people, who are all truly essential workers, are seeing that they are not without voice and without power and without dignity. And this, it seems to me, is a profoundly religious moment in many ways. This moment of that realization that we are not cogs in a machine, we are not objects, we are not mere means, but we are a spark of the divine, and we are entitled to be treated that way. And if we're not, there's something we can do about it. I think that Catholic social teaching's emphasis on solidarity speaks to this dynamic as much as any body of intellectual work. And so I find this period, this moment, profoundly hopeful. And I think it's profoundly hopeful, not just in the terms I just laid out, but in terms of the future and the viability of American democracy. If you go to any of these picket lines, you will find people people who voted for every conceivable choice standing together. You will find people of different religions standing together. You will find immigrants and native-born workers standing together. You will find people transcending every division that we are told divides us. You will find gay and straight. You will find African American and white and Latino and Asian. You will find every face America shows is on a picket line today. Now we're gonna close here by I'm gonna ask my friend Eric to say a word or two about his work here and his work looking into the history of this institution and what it teaches us about possibility. And I think then we'll wrap it up and take whatever time we have.
Well, I think people want to start some Q&A, so I can also take a little bit of that final question as we take some questions from the audience. And I know people online from around the world, from Lebanon and Peru, who've tuned in to be with us. I know you have instructions to send questions to the Jubilee team in Washington, D.C. So thanks to Olivia Engling, and who's a St. Ben's graduate, and our team in the office taking questions and sending them to Matt Lindstrom. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to perhaps take one stack of questions from the audience and a stack online, and then Damon and I will offer some concluding remarks.
Right on. Thanks, Damon. Eric, that was fantastic. I think you hit on the top level, a lot of top level stuff, the kind of intellectual history, especially St. John, St. Ben's. Let me drill down specifics right here, right now. 2 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a student at St. John's. Professor Lindstrom, I want to start a union among student workers here at St. John, St. Ben's. How do I do it? Should I do it? What do we do? Right? So, I want to talk about campus student employee unions. I want to talk about unions within faith groups. Do they exist? Why should they exist? And what are your thoughts on that? Maybe not, well, specifically here, but elsewhere. Also, you mentioned this, like, what's the word inequality was tossed around a lot. Is there a right level of inequality? Right? What is that? So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. And we'll pass the first one is nitty-gritty on the ground, right? St. Ben, St. John's campus employees and and then the faith groups, and then what's the right level of inequality? By the way, the question on inequality came from online as well.
Great.
Yeah. So other questions, we'll pass the mic around.
So I'll answer that. I was wondering whether, Matt, you were going to ask for the manual, for the how-to.
I know some folks might be interested here, but they also might want to
come see me
know
after
how
class.
to
As they say,
burn it too.
Right. So the answer to your question conceptually is very brief. The workers at the Afl Cio have a union. In fact, several. They're quite insistent. And I speak as a member of management. We believe very strongly that being organized and bargaining collectively is something every worker should do. Everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. Of course, people have to decide for them. I mean, that's, be able to make their own decisions, but in principle, that's what we think. We think that the question is sort of like the question of, should you have a congressperson? Not who should your congressperson be, but should you have one? Should some people have congresspeople and other people not? Right? You laugh because it's a ridiculous question. Right? And that's kind of how we feel about that kind of question. And there has been some tension at times with organizations in the religious world over this, but that's the Afl Cio's view. How much inequality is enough or okay or not objectionable? There's a big economic literature on that, but I think that question has to be thought about globally, and my friend Eric is one of the world's experts on that question.
Thank you. This actually ties in to the question that you closed by asking me in terms of some of the history that has taken place here at St. Ben's and St. John's and the monastic communities, where we really saw from the 1880s through the 1940s the monastic communities being a real force to deal with the series of economic crises that plagued this part of the world. From the 1880s, when 4 consecutive years here in Stearns County in central Minnesota, we had the grasshopper plagues, where our friends in Africa are struggling with the same issue, where for 4 years in Minnesota here, the locusts came down and devoured everything. Wheat prices crashing, the stock market crash. We were dealing with a time where the crisis wasn't in another country. The crisis was not in another continent. The crisis was here, and it was at our very doorsteps. And through that crisis, there were writers here in the monastic communities. There were people that we would now call labor organizers and organizers here in the community who found a lot of ways to respond to that question of crisis. As I've been up here over the past few months, I've been visiting some farmers out in Holdingford, which is about 9 miles past Avon. And as I've been visiting there and getting to know folks, there comes a point where they ask me, Eric, what is it you work on? And I say, well, I work on, trying to solve financial crisis, making sure everyone has enough. And every single farmer in Holdingford, the first thing that they say is, my grandfather or my great-grandparents, they were built a whiskey still by the Abbey in the 1920s or 30s when wheat had crashed and in the Great Depression. And then there was this guy here, Virgil Michael, a monk, who worked with labor unions and really actually wrote a lot about this question of what is enough. We call that Jubilee economics, this idea that there is enough for everyone, there is abundance. It's what he focused on in terms of response. And that's a really important part of our history here because it wasn't only something impacting Stearns County, that affected Catholic and Christian teaching globally. It also lifted actual responses to financial crisis that are being debated right now by the IMF and the G20. Getting at what does it mean, whether crisis or not, for us to have enough. And what we look at global policies, when we look at that question of equality and enough, it means that everyone, no matter who they are, where they come from, that they should be able to have access to education, access to health care, access to be able to put enough food on the tables of their family. And that's so critical in the policies being debated now, because when we have to understand what does inequality mean, inequality means that there are 80 people in the world, 80 people that have more wealth than half of the world's population. 3.5 billion people live in extreme poverty, half of our world's population, and more than half lives in poverty. But there are 80 human beings who have more resources than half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people. So we're looking at, what's too much, what's enough, and these structural policies that we work on at Treasury, at the White House, at the IMF and G20, what we're talking about is everyone having enough and not a small group having too much. And that's the Jubilee promise, that God has created a rich and abundant world, and we're closest to God when we're sharing those resources among us. We're closest to one another. We're closest to the Creator when we're protected from having too little or too much.
Don, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question on climate change and then pass it around. We have time for 2 more questions. So there's a question from online, and a student had a question too on climate change. Talk about how your organizations work on that issue, and in general or in specific, but also to what extent do the members or constituencies of your organizations throw up roadblocks for quote unquote advancements in climate change? I mean, there's a blue-green alliance, but there's also unions that oppose initiatives on climate.
So, all right. So Matt referred to an organization. The Blue-Green Alliance is a coalition of unions and environmental groups. It includes a number of unions that have a lot of members in fossil fuel industries. It's not, and so. But let me speak sort of more broadly. The labor movement, without exception, believes that man-made caused climate change is an existential threat to humanity. That there is no union that disagrees with that proposition, and we believe that rapid efforts need to be made to decarbonize the world's economy. Now, we also represent a lot of people who work and in various ways or live in communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel economy. And if we were to be honest, we would say that all of us are, right? That in one degree, to one degree or another, we are all enmeshed in this web. And we believe that that to get out, to solve this problem, Rich Trumka, who was, after all, a coal miner, right, said on numerous occasions over the last 15 years, that urgent action was necessary. And then he said more recently, not long before he died, he said, we have to have a just transition away from carbon fuels, or there will be no transition. Now, some people interpreted that as a threat. It wasn't. It wasn't. It was a prophecy. What he meant was that if we don't ensure that the jobs in the new energy economy that we are building are good jobs that meet the standards that Eric was talking about a moment or two ago, and that include the right to organize and collectively bargain. Right? If we don't do that, then in a democratic society, people will not vote to make the transition, because they will understand it as so much of economic change of the last 40 years in this country and elsewhere in the developed world. They will understand it to be a transition from economic security to economic insecurity, a transition from affluence to poverty, a transition back to a transition potentially back to the kind of life that people lived around here when Virgil Michael was around. Right? Nobody will vote for that. Right? And the consequence of not bringing economic justice to bear on the climate transition, right, will be catastrophic. Right? There will be no transition, and we will meet the full force of climate catastrophe head on. Right? This is the labor movement's. This is what we have to say about climate change. Right? Is that we cannot afford an economically unjust, plutocratic, neoliberal approach to climate change. If that's what is offered, then the result will be climate catastrophe. And if we look at the recent history of climate policy around the developed world, you will see this unfolding over and over and over again. You will see it. This is the story, more or less, of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protest against gasoline taxes in France. This is the story of episode after episode in the United States, where we have people where we have political problems moving climate policy because of this issue of economic justice. And so that's what we have to say about this. We are working very hard right now, today. The Afl Cio is working very hard with the Biden administration, with the Senate and the House, to move enormous investments in good jobs in renewable energy. Right? That's what we're for. Right? And we are for making sure that that the people who built the relatively prosperous and secure society we live in now are taken care of properly. Right? That the cost of climate change, the cost of addressing climate change, is not borne by sick and dying retired coal miners. Right? I prefer that Mike Bloomberg bear some of that cost. Right? And that is, that's kind of where we're coming from.
Thank you, Damon. Eric, 30 seconds or less.
Thank
All right,
you.
45 seconds. I know you.
That transition you're talking about is really important, that we can't leave workers behind. And the reality is we are such a wealthiest society with so much abundance and so much ingenuity, we can figure out how to do it, but it's about bringing some different sides together. The very concept and what we're talking about today in terms of public engagement. I think just to answer that, climate piece from Jubilee's perspective, people are familiar with the Biden executive order about rejoining the Paris Accord. But what the media didn't do a good job on reporting was the most important part of that executive order. The part of the executive order that Jubilee USA worked on which was instructing the Treasury and instructing every political apparatus of the United States to engage with the International Monetary Fund and the G20 on this idea of climate finance. That because of debt restructuring, because of economic policies, trade and tax policies, these new aid policies, and how right now more countries in the world are facing financial crisis than ever before. Most countries in the world are in financial crisis right now at this moment, that there's an opportunity as all of these decisions are about to be made on climate to actually pay attention and make them where the financial decision makers will make the most consequential decisions on climate change, really in our lifetimes, we believe, over the next 5 years. And so that's where Jubilee's focus is at. It's at that really important question around where the climate decisions are going to be made, and they're going to be made as a part of global pandemic response.
All right, audience members, anyone? Microphone around. Okay, 1 second. It's on the other side of the room.
A very quick question to Damon. Are you also? You said you're talking to the Biden administration about this stuff. Are you talking to Joe Manchin?
We speak a lot to Joe Manchin. I'm not really at liberty to say what we say.
All right, another question?
I guess this is, you've touched on it already, but I'm really concerned with the lack of cooperation in Congress. Do you see hope for some kind of compromises? It just seems we are so polarized in a way that I've never seen before in terms of our Senate and Congress.
We may have somewhat different answers about that question. I'll speak very briefly because I want to give people. Sorry, I'll speak very briefly about this. I want to give people a little bit of hope. And to the gentleman who asked about Joe Manchin, the labor movement believes that we need to pass President Biden's jobs agenda. We need to pass the infrastructure investment, and we need to pass the full $3.5 trillion in the reconciliation package that the White House proposed and worked with Senator Sanders to develop. Right? That's what we want. We want it all. All right? And we've made that very clear to Senator Manchin. And we want very strong labor standards in those bills. And we want comprehensive labor law reform, and we want comprehensive immigration reform, and we want the right to vote protected. Right? That's the workers' agenda in Washington today. Now, I am highly confident. I'm highly confident that I don't know what the number's going to be. I wouldn't pretend to guess that a majority in Congress will come together and pass both of President Biden's jobs bills and do so before the end of the year. Right? I believe that's going to happen. Now, I'm not prepared to predict that there will be the necessary reform in the rules to protect our democracy and protect our rights at work. I wouldn't predict whether, and to protect the rights of immigrants in our society. Right? We need filibuster reform in order to make those things happen. You can hear my boss, the president of the Afl Cio, Liz Schuler, talk about this on that video I mentioned before better than I can. But I give you, in terms of your question about functionality in Congress, I think that what you're hearing right now is sort of the shouting. These issues are going to move. But there's a deeper question, which maybe is what you were asking, which is what is the possibility for cooperation across party lines in Congress? And I think we're in a very difficult time around that, and I don't think we have time to fully explore why. But it's not always been thus in this country. And I think it has a lot to do with runaway inequality, why it's so difficult to have cross-party cooperation right now. But as Eric said a few moments ago, you are in the presence of somebody who actually has successfully achieved cross-party cooperation in the interests of economic justice. And rather than me talk about that, I'm going to turn it to Eric to talk about it.
So that's, in terms of Jubilee and the religious community, that's been a lot of our focus. How do we bring together Republicans and Democrats in terms of moving the needle when it matters? And just to give a few examples over the past 5 years, 6 years, which have been incredibly important because religious leaders stood up and spoke, and not only spoke both to Republicans and Democrats, not only were welcomed in the door by Republicans and Democrats, but actually worked with leaders in Congress, the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership, to broker and negotiate a solution. And all of the work that we do on economics, we really don't work on anything or move anything forward until we've secured support from both Republican leadership and Democratic leadership. So a few examples on this, and Damon has worked with us on some of these pieces as well. But in 2016, we helped create and pass the only bipartisan piece of legislation that was passed by Congress and signed into law. In 2016, Republicans controlled both the Senate and the House, and Obama sat in the White House. And during this incredible crisis that impacted Puerto Rico, that still continues but is now being negotiated because of emergency debt crisis legislation, in 2016, that piece of legislation passed with majorities of Republicans and Democrats and signed into law by President Obama. And what does that mean? I mean, it means that there is some future, there is some chance for the 60% of kids that are living in poverty, American citizens in Puerto Rico. Through the Trump administration, one of the most important things that religious leaders did was move forward negotiations on new trade policies. Not perfect, but we saw the U.S.-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. We saw it pass with a very terrible arbitration process being destroyed, an arbitration process that harmed the environment, did not favor workers, an arbitration process that supported polluters as opposed to people living in a country affected by what a corporation was doing. And with the Trump administration, we were able to remove some of the most harmful provisions of those policies and put in place some positive ones, because religious leaders brought Republicans and Democrats together and said, let's work on this. And right now, as a part of global pandemic response, where some of the most consequential economic decisions will be made that will affect global poverty for decades, will affect whether or not it's even possible we can reach the sustainable development goals that the UN has laid out for us to reach by the end of 2030. We're seeing amazing work taking place with Republicans and Democrats coming together to look at debt relief and aid for developing countries as they struggle with the crisis. So these are, I think, some key examples. Another area is also on corruption. After working on a piece of legislation for the last 10 years, the Jubilee Corporate Transparency Act, we passed that through the Trump administration with majorities in Congress and now signed into law, that essentially is going to mean that it's going to be much harder for corrupt officials around the world to steal money from their people. So these are things that have happened. These are some of the untold stories where the religious community has been vital in bringing together Republicans, Democrats, both sides of the aisle to win solutions.
Right on that positive note, we're going to end this show. Thank you very much, Damon and Eric. Audience members, please join me in a round of applause. As you see, there's info on Jubilee USA, and our guests will be lingering around if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Well,